Thank you everyone for joining in tonight. My name is Ashley DeHoyas. I'm the curator at DiverseWorks. I appreciate y'all spending Thursday night with us in our panel. And we can't wait to share more about our conversations surrounding history as contemporary and thinking about what it means to embark in community healing and create awareness for Sugarland 95. We're here tonight because DiverseWorks has been working with an artist named Candice D'Meza to commission a new project called Whale, which is an artistic documentary film project that was birthed out of a series of conversations, negotiations, community conversations in honor to I created in honor to support or honor the Sugarland 95. Candice has been asking a lot of really interesting questions about how do we memorialize different individuals that have inhabited the land and Sugarland connected to the Bullhead Cemetery, as well as how do we begin community healing. So we're super excited. The film is located on the DiverseWorks website. And can be watched live stream or free online through YouTube until November 14th. And Candice will share a little bit more about her work later. I'm going to pass it over to Erica, who's going to introduce herself and the African American Library at the Gregory School. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Good evening, everyone, and greetings from the African American Library at the Gregory School. As Ashley said, my name is Erica Thompson, and I'm the community liaison here. And on behalf of our team and our manager, Miguel Caesar, we're just so thrilled to have you all join us this evening. It's always a treat for us to be able to link up with our community partners to explore the dynamic history of Houston and the surrounding areas in new and different ways. I do want to personally thank Ashley for all of her efforts in making tonight's program possible, and the DiverseWorks team as well for just being such really incredible partners to us. For those of you who are joining us and may not already be familiar, the African American Library at the Gregory School rounds out a trio of special collections research centers under the umbrella of the Houston Public Library System. We are located just outside downtown in Freedmanstown, 4th Ward, and we are housed in the building that was once Gregory Elementary School, which was the first school for free Black children in the city after emancipation. Our focus here at Gregory is the preservation and celebration of Houston's African American history and culture. And we do this through exhibits, oral history, programming, but the true star of our show is our archival collection. Conversations like tonight's really highlight the necessary work of guarding and protecting the truth of our lived experiences, particularly so when the details of the story turn dark and the circumstances more difficult. So again, we thank you for joining us. And for anyone interested in learning more about the Gregory School and the work that we do, I will drop a link in my contact information in the chat. And so before we introduce our panelists, I'm going to turn it back over to Ashley for our land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Erica. So briefly, we wanted to take time to acknowledge that we are in a critical moment in building, and we want to build mutual respect and connection. And would like to acknowledge that our offices are located on the ancestral lands of the Atacapa Ishak, the Karankawa people, and recognize the Native people that share the Southeast Texas region, including the Texas Carrizo Comecrudo, the Tonkawa, and the Kulanteca. We acknowledge that this land is occupied unceded territory and pay tribute to them. We honor their elders, past and present, as well as future generations. For those of you who'd like to do the same in this moment, we ask you to please put the land in which you reside and or call in your own ancestors in the chat. We'd also like to take a brief moment to acknowledge the inhabitants and people who have worked, lived, and in the land and Sugarland that have been associated to the Sugarland 95, the Texas prison labor camps that have worked, been enslaved, or that have occupied the land before this history has been recorded. So thank you so much. And Erica, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, thank you. So I am thrilled this evening to welcome to our platform Dr. Theresa Jach. Theresa holds a PhD in United States history from the University of Houston. Go Cougs. She has written about convict leasing and the Texas prison system. She has authored, edited, and contributed to several works, including Incarcerated Women, A History of Struggles, Oppression, and Resistance in American Prisons, and Back to Bondage, the study on the Sugarland 95. Theresa served on the City of Sugarland Task Force, on the Sugarland 95, and the Fort Bend Independent School District Advisory Board on the Sugarland 95 as well. We also have joining us this evening, Mr. Sam Collins. Sam Collins III is a graduate of Texas A&M University, which we will not hold against him. He serves on the boards of advisors for the National Trust for Historic Preservation and Ruby Bridges Foundation. Sam is a tireless preservationist, having served on the Texas Historical Commission State Board of Review, Galveston Historical Foundation, the NIA Cultural Center, and has worked with the 1867 settlement community in Texas City and the Juneteenth Legacy Project. Born in Galveston and raised in Hitchcock, Texas, Sam purchased and successfully preserved the historic Stringfellow Orchards property in Hitchcock, and was successful in adding the site to the National Register of Historic Places in 2013. So welcome to Sam and to Theresa, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Naomi Reed, a social cultural anthropologist and assistant professor of anthropology at Southwestern University. Her research focuses on race, education, cultural heritage, and criminal justice. She has spent the last decade connecting ethnographic fieldwork in Sugarland, Texas, where she explores the racial thinking of local white residents and institutions, schools, heritage foundations, local governments. She recently joined the board of the Convict Leasing Labor Project. She was raised in Missouri City, Texas, and grew up in the shadows of Sugarland's wealth and reputation as a sweeter place to live in the Southwest Houston. Candice D'Meza is a mother of two, actor, writer, filmmaker, multidisciplinary artist, whose writings and actings have been featured in American theater magazines, the Houston Chronicle, and the Houston Press. As an actor, Candice is a proud member of Arts Equity Union and has acted with the Catastrophic Theater, the Ensemble Theater, Rec Room, the Alley Theater, and the Alley Theater. She has been called a Houston theater actor to watch and been awarded 4 awards, including the 2018 Best Utility Player Award by the Houston Press. Her writing and uses forms of memoir, prose, and playwriting focus on topics of grief and joy, restorative justice, abolition, and liberation as viewed through the Black imagination. The mixing of social science fiction, African and African diaspora folklore, and Afrofuturism. Her one-woman show, Fatherland, combines Haitian voodoo, spirituality, and a personal memoir with experimental film and ritual theater into a multi-layered performance that is a deeply vulnerable exploration into the grief that comes from disconnection from family, from culture, and from the homelands. Her most recent project, commissioned by us, DiverseWorks, is now on view until November 14th. Okay, and Erica, I guess we'll pass it over to Theresa.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen, and I am tasked with giving a 8-minute history of convict leasing, which is going to be difficult, but I'm going to do my best to just give you a brief overview of convict leasing in Texas. So basically, convict leasing is renting out prisoners for labor, and it addressed 3 issues that were problems for Texas and really all of the southern states. It met the demand by white landowners for a labor force that they could coerce and control, just like they had enslaved people. And the prison in Huntsville was small and dilapidated after the Civil War. and it was not big enough to hold the number of prisoners that were coming into it. And then the third reason is that the state of Texas was broke and they needed money and they could not afford to update the prison or take care of the prisoners that they had. So the prison in Huntsville was built in 1849. And here is an image of the prison. This is from about 1866, right after the Civil War, and that shows the inside of the courtyard of the walls. It was designed originally just to hold white prisoners because enslaved people were punished on the plantations and they rarely made it into the formal criminal justice system. After the Civil War, though, there's going to be a really dramatic increase in the number of arrests and convictions of African Americans, and they are targeted by newly designed laws that were really about controlling their labor. So an example would be vagrancy statutes. They were in Texas and all the southern states. That made it illegal to not have a job. And for African American men and women, that job had to be working for white people on their land in some kind of extractive agriculture. And if they weren't, they would be arrested for vagrancy. Other ridiculous laws, speaking loudly in front of a white woman, walking on the railroad tracks, or an example here in Houston, there were a group of African American men that sold smoked meat off of a pushcart downtown, and local white restaurant owners didn't like the competition. And so the Houston City Council passed a law making it illegal to sell food on a pushcart. And all of those men were then arrested for vagrancy. Other examples of supposed crimes that were sending Black Texans to the penitentiary in this early period. And also we have children as young as 10 in the Huntsville prison. One man was sentenced to 2 years for stealing 5 cents, another for taking half a plug of tobacco. One man was sentenced to 7 years for taking an orange. And another man was convicted of theft when all he did was take some wool out of a trash can and he spun it into yarn and made a pair of socks out of it, and he ended up in prison. So in Texas and the rest of the South, there isn't any money to maintain the penitentiaries, let alone repair them. And so Southern states began experimenting with how they can use convict labor. They have chain gangs working on roads, and I'll just show you some quick images. This is from North Carolina, showing prisoners in a chain gang, and they house them in these railroad cars. This image is from Alabama, a road crew. And then we have another road crew in Georgia. So they're trying to figure out what to do with them. And they think that public works is a good idea. But Texas will begin experimenting with leasing out convicts in 1867. And there was some debate about whether it was legal that you could actually do this. And they were hesitant to do more than what they were, just a few prisoners being leased out. But in 1871, there's a court case that comes in front of the Virginia Supreme Court, Ruffin v. Commonwealth. And that court decision, Woody Ruffin is a convict that kills another convict while they're out working on a chain gang. He is tried and convicted and sentenced to death by the prison, so within the jurisdiction of the prison. And he's going to appeal that, saying that he should be tried in the county where the crime was committed and not by the prison. But the court is going to rule against him, and they are going to say that during his term of service in the penitentiary, a prisoner is in a state of penal servitude to the state. He is, for the time being, the slave of the state. And this ruling is going to affect convict leasing across the South. Prisoners are determined to be civilly dead, meaning that they do not have any rights. So after this ruling, Texas is going to, the legislature will lease out the entire prison system for a flat rate to a Galveston area company called the Ward Dewey and Company. And Ward and Dewey are going to use some of the convicts on their private farms, and then they're going to sublease others to area planters and railroad companies. They're going to pay the state $5,000 a year for the first 5 years of their contract, and then that's going to increase to $20,000 a year for the last 5 of the 15-year contract. And not only does this provide money to the state, it also eliminates the expense that they would incur by operating a prison. So not only is the state happy about it, but Ward and Dewey are happy because they're going to make a lot of money. And then Ward and Dewey are making so much money subleasing convicts. They send a lot of money to the state treasury, but there are a lot of abuses, and those will be uncovered in a legislative investigation in 1875. And the abuses they uncover are absolutely shocking. What outraged the public the most, though, were a group of military prisoners being held in Huntsville that were beaten and starved, and then they were transferred to a federal prison in Kansas, and they were nearly dead when they arrived. This actually made national news and was quite shameful for Texas, and so the legislature will investigate. And when they investigate in 1875, they find even more shocking abuses. They found out that men had been killed in the stocks, choked to death. One man had less than 17 days left to serve, and his neck was broken in the stocks. So this image, this is not stocks in Texas, this is in Delaware. And the stocks in Texas, they actually were so high that the prisoner would have to stand on their tiptoes. And then as they would get tired, they would put pressure on their neck, and that's what would choke them to death. Guards regularly whipped prisoners, sometimes giving them hundreds of lashes at a time. And there were reports of guards kicking, striking, hitting convicts with boards, sticks, rocks. All of these were unlawful forms of punishment, but they didn't stop. Particularly at the outside camps outside of the prison proper in Huntsville, they were isolated, and it made abuse much more common because nobody was checking up on them. The investigation also uncovered shocking sexual abuse of female inmates in Huntsville. Women were not separated from men, and several women inmates were pregnant. One episode, guards arrived to work, and they found Ward and Dewey passed out drunk in the prison courtyard with drunk, partially nude female convicts. And women reported that if they refused the advances of Ward and Dewey, that they would be punished. This image shows, I've superimposed these 2 pictures. The one on the left is A.J. Ward's house, and he is actually standing on the front porch there. And then it's superimposed over an image of the entrance to Huntsville. So he lived right next to it. And then Dewey actually lived inside the prison. He had an apartment inside of the prison. And so in 1876, approximately 300 or 17% of convicts had escaped. The death rate was even more shocking. 109 had died from disease, mostly malaria, but there was also measles, smallpox, pneumonia. Guards had killed 28 prisoners that were recorded, and 182 were unaccounted for by officials, which meant they were just missing and they don't know what happened to them. So by the end of, I went out of order, I'm sorry. By the end of 1876, the Texas legislature decides that Ward and Dewey are too much of a problem, and they are going to take the lease away from them. They're going to give it then to Cunningham and Ellis, and their lease is supposed to go from until 1883. So Edward Cunningham, and we have a photograph of him there, and Little Barry Ellis, they had actually formed a partnership in 1875 and purchased several thousand acres of land in Fort Bend and Brazoria counties. And they actually did this in anticipation of winning a bid for the prison system. And using convict labor, they are going to create one of the largest sugar plantations in the country, creating what will eventually become imperial sugar in Sugar Land, Texas. By 1880, Cunningham and Ellis were working 1,044 convicts on their own private plantation and subleasing out the remaining convicts, which was over 1,100. People that leased convicts from Cunningham and Ellis paid $3.01 per convict per month. And the Cunningham Ellis lease paid the state an average of $73,468 a year. And they're leasing convicts out to all of the Sugar Bowl counties, which is Fort Bend and Wharton, Matagorda, and Brazoria. Now, the prison system provides the guards because they are supposed to have some supervision over what's going on, but inspections are rare and abuses are really common under this lease as well. So even though the new lease is bringing in a lot of money to the state, there are problems in those outside camps. Between 1878 and 1880, 256 convicts had died from disease and abuse, and there were 366 escapes. As the end of the Cunningham Ellis lease approaches, the state decides that they need to not end leasing because they want to make the money themselves. The state decides that they are going to become the lessee for the prison. They are going to try to cut out the middleman, which is Cunningham and Ellis, and make the money for themselves so they can keep all of the profits. After the lease ends for Cunningham and Ellis in 1883, both of these men are going to lease convicts from the prison themselves to work their sugar plantations. And it was on Ellis's land, of course, that the Sugar Land 95 are uncovered. So this is an image from Back to Bondage showing the position of those men that were subjected to this horrible system. So the state takes over leasing convicts. They will also at the same time start buying prison farms so that they can work convicts that were not fit to lease, that they couldn't make money on leasing. They are also going to finally in 1884 move women to a separate prison farm. So they take them out of Huntsville. In 1886, the first large prison farm will be purchased in Texas. That is Harlem Prison Farm in Fort Bend County. Today, that is Jester Prison Farm. And the state-owned prison farm is very profitable. This is going to help pave the way to end leasing because the state sees that they can make money farming on a state-owned prison farm system. And Harlem actually made enough money in its first 2 years to fund the entire prison system for those 2 years. So it is very profitable for them. We do start moving into the progressive era at this point, and the progressive era is a period of reform-minded changes in society. And there is some focus on reforming the penitentiary, not just in the South, across the country. And in Texas, there is a push to end convict leasing. There are 2 major investigations into the prison system by the legislature, one in 1902 and one in 1910, that uncover a multitude of abuses and corruption that will eventually lead to the end of leasing. So in 1902, the investigation committee declared that the lease system was a disgrace and should be abolished, although it's going to take them another 10 years to do it. This is a quote from that investigation. It says, as a rule, the life of a convict is not as valuable as that of a dog. As evidence thereof, we find that the average life of a convict is 7 years. When men are shot down like dogs and are worked until they drop dead under this system, the people of Texas cannot hope to escape the responsibility for these wrongs. The existing methods are harsh, cruel, inhumane, and unworthy of an enlightened people. But again, it's going to take them 10 more years to do anything about it. In 1908, The state is going to purchase the 5,200 acre Imperial Farm from Cunningham and Ellis. And you think, okay, why would Cunningham and Ellis sell their land to the state? Well, they knew that leasing was going to end soon, and they know that they will not be able to have adequate labor to grow sugar. So their best bet then is to sell that land to the state and then let convicts grow sugarcane, and then they would buy that sugarcane and process it at their sugar mill. And this is true for many, many farmers that had relied on convict leasing. They sell their land to the state, and so we get scattered prison farms throughout the area. So the legislature is going to pass a prison reform law in 1910 that will require that convict leasing ends by 1914. So that law says it must end no later than 1914. But the governor at the time is Oscar Colquitt, and he is going to move that timeline up. It starts in 1912 when he asks the prison board to ban the use of the whip and the bat as punishment for convicts. And this is a quote from Colquitt. There he is. He said, "Before the legislative investigation, the severest brutalities were practiced in the handling and management of prisoners. They were whipped with leather straps, 5 feet long, 3 inches wide, and ½ an inch thick upon their naked backs. And as long as I am the governor of this state, the whip shall not be used again." And this is an image of the bat. It is made out of leather. This is housed at the Prison Museum up in Huntsville. They will switch to other forms of punishment. They use dark cell, chains, those sorts of things. It will lead to an immediate dip in profitability on the farms when they stop whipping prisoners, but Colquitt is determined. And then he will also end convict leasing in 1912, which is 2 years earlier than had been dictated by that 1910 law. And once leasing ended, the state bought more and more prison farms to work convicts. They were always looking for a way to make money off of convict labor, which of course would give the state a reason to arrest more Black men and women. And because we have these racialized laws that target African Americans, a larger portion of African Americans were being incarcerated than what their actual percentage in the Texas population was. And it has a really profound impact because if there's a disproportionately large number of Black people in prison, the public and also law enforcement begin to see African Americans as more prone to criminality. And it leads us into this legacy of convict leasing that, of course, is still pervasive in our criminal justice system today. So it has a very strong impact on what we see even now. So I am done. And thank you.
Well, I guess tag, I'm it, Samuel Collins III here in Galveston, Texas, and a proud Aggie for Erica. So don't hold that against me. But before I start, I do want to mention that my work in this area began with Mr. Reginald Moore when I met him on April 4th, 2018. That was the very first time that I met Mr. Moore. And he found out I was on the board with the National Trust. And as many of you know, once he grabs a hold of you, or did grab a hold of you, you couldn't get out of that constriction he had you. And I'm so thankful that he brought me in to educate me and bring me up to speed with a lot of the information and knowledge that he shared with me. So the first part of my presentation was to talk about the creation of CLLP, the Convict Leasing and Labor Project. I was with Mr. Moore when he organized the board and the individuals that worked with us, Richard Vogel, his wife, Dr. Vogel, Barbara Jones, Captain Matthews from the Buffalo Soldier Museum, Dr. Juan Galvez, Naomi Carrier. I'm hoping I'm not leaving anybody. Liz and Jay Jenkins, And Mr. Moore was forming the organization to hopefully tell the truth of what happened. Maya Angelou has a quote: "History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again." And hopefully we will have the courage to tell the truth of the history of what happened. So as we unshackle the change from the restrictions of telling the truth of what actually happened. Here in Galveston, I'm on the southwest corner of 22nd and Strand, and this is the location in which Gordon Granger came and made the announcement that the enslaved people of Texas were free. But the second sentence in General Order number 3 says, "This involves an absolute equality." So when we think about the word equality and absolute, when the former enslaved individuals heard those words, and when they were written by Major Frederick Emory, not Granger, Emory was under the command of Granger. When he wrote that here in Galveston, it began this process of hope for these individuals that freedom had finally arrived. But as you saw in Dr. Jach's presentation, immediately after that, in 1867, they began figuring ways to re-enslave individuals and put them back on plantation sites. And the largest enslaver actually had a home here in Galveston, Robert Mills and his brother David. David lived on the plantations in Brazoria. They actually owned 7 plantations, 4 in Brazoria County, 2 in Matagorda County, and 1 in Fort Bend County. And the reason that I'm bringing all of this up is to show the interconnectedness of the communities, that even though Mills was here living where Kempner Park is today, he had business interests in Fort Bend County, Matagorda County, Brazoria County, where these plantations were located. And immediately after enslavement was over, they started calculating ways to put individuals right back to work in those very same places. So when you look on a property record, tax rolls, and you look at the property records, the most valuable thing on the records are the enslaved people. As an example, on one report, Mills had 268 enslaved people worth $108,000, and he had 16,000 acres worth $80,000. So the enslaved people, 268 was worth more than the 16,000 acres of land. But what they began to do is then transfer the value or worth into the land, because there was no more material value in people, enslaved people, and then use the land as leverage to then put the enslaved people back as sharecroppers and prisoners. Now, it's very important. I think we focus so often on the people that were part of the prison system, but individuals were living under the cloud of possible incarceration. So even though they may not have had physical chains on their bodies, they were living in a system in which, as examples that Dr. Jach used, the gentleman taking something out of the trash and making some socks and being sentenced to multiple years of imprisonment, or changing the laws. Dick Gregory had a quote once that legal has you confused with right. You think because something was legal that it was right, but many of these laws that were written, we now know, and even then they were not right, but the laws were changed to then make what used to be legal behavior illegal, all to gain an economic advantage. James Baldwin has a great quote: "To be Negro in this country and somewhat conscious is to be in a constant rage." So when I think about this process of memorializing the Sugarland 95 and the work that Mr. Moore and his team was doing, Mr. Moore did not have the academic credentials to afford him the respect that he should have received from the community and those working with him. And as he was trying to set this up to tell the truth and have the courage, I believe the additional stress contributed to his early demise. And while not singularly responsible for his death, the additional stress and the additional stress on those that do this work. Because when I'm reading books about female prisoners that were impregnated by guards, when I've had to put the books down because it just becomes so overwhelming that you can't take it all in. It becomes so emotional when you think about the unnecessary abuse. And when will we as human beings learn to be more respectful of each other and treat each other more decently, not because of race or gender or all of those things that divide us, but when will we just see each other as humans and treat each other fairly? So this work is very challenging. So when we think about African-American sites and preservation, what is an African-American site? Well, I would argue that all of these sites have some relation to African Americans. As I sit here in this building, the fingerprints of the enslaved people are all around me. The physical building contains bricks that were shaped by the hands of enslaved people and laid in place prior to the end of enslavement here. So we often do not see them because they're hidden behind the paint and the plaster of the building, and the fingerprints of the enslaved people are in banking, housing, healthcare, education, criminal justice. It is all around us, but we don't always recognize it because it has not been identified and highlighted or pointed out. So when I take people through the building, I take them into the hallway so that they could see these bricks. And while you may not see an individual physical fingerprint, what I'm trying to demonstrate and what I'm trying to get across to you is that these historic sites all around us contain the evidence of the presence of the African Americans that lived here in these spaces before us that helped to build our communities. So there in Sugar Land, a great deal of the wealth came from the labor of those convict laborers. And then also from those sharecroppers and others. So in that example of the tax rolls, they had 160 horses for $8,000. So the horses were maybe valued at $50 a piece. They had 2,500 head of cattle for $12,500. But what you will find after enslavement ended is that then the cost of everything that was needed to run the operation or to sharecrop was increased. They would then sell that higher price item to the sharecroppers or people working the land. And if they were not in a physical bondage of chains on the prison form, they were financially bound to these places too. So there's a great deal of additional work that has to be done outside of just the prison system to tell the truth of these African-American spaces that are sites that are all around us that are hidden in plain sight. So I don't want to go over my time, but I do want to mention also Hannah Kim is another young lady that we work with from Harvard University that has done a great deal of work with the Convict Leasing and Labor Project. You know, one of the things that I learned throughout that process, it was very difficult to get the new nonprofit up and running. There were challenges, and then they formed new groups that later are telling the story. But I don't want us to forget the sacrifice of Mr. Moore and his life to make this a reality. And then when you're doing the work in the communities, I want to encourage you to partner with many individuals that have been doing the work for decades, but may not have had the academic credentials to get credit for their work. So tag, next person is it. So I'll be here for question and answers afterwards. But this is important work. We must tell the truth about what happened. We must face it with courage so that it could never, ever be repeated. Across from me on the north side of the Strand is where the largest auction house was located. So we need to make sure that that history is never repeated, and we need to do what we can to even address mass incarceration and the continued residual effects of this history on our present. Thank you.
Okay, so I am next. I am Naomi Reed, and I am a sociocultural anthropologist, as Ashley mentioned early on. And part of what I'm going to do is talk about my observations of how the Sugarland 95 have been dealt with by the city of Sugarland, by the Fort Bend Independent School District, and by local community organizations, and kind of give a critical response to that, as that's what I do. Let me share my screen with you. Okay. So if someone could just let me know that that's successfully projected, maybe in the chat. Okay, perfect. So like I said, this is anthropological observations and memorializing the Sugarland 95. Definitely what I'm observing is in progress, right? The school district, the city, residents, organizations are still in process, right? Of trying to make sense of what happened here, how to properly memorialize them, and what role they play within the city of Sugarland historically and in Sugarland's current idea about its identity. So, like I said, much of what I have done for a long time is to try to understand the way in which Sugarland thinks of itself, right? I started this work looking at a local high school that was predominantly white and Asian, trying to understand students' understandings of whiteness and blackness, their own identities, and in part how the city helps shape those ideas. So part of that work is looking at things like monuments in the city, local magazine publications, the way in which the city tells its own history. So of course, when the Sugarland 95 were unearthed, it definitely gave me pause, right, to try to see, well, what is the city going to do, right? Traditionally, as you can see in these images, Sugarland is very much invested in a colonial white history. With the famous selfie statue in the Sugarland Town Square, there's kind of this white teenage lifestyle that's very representative of this space. These pictures of these young children, they're participating in Colonial Day in their school. And so for most of the representations of Sugarland that you get, it is very white, is very colonial, and is not a Black story, right? We're not sending a message that this was ever a Black space or that this town is moving into being a Black space. I do include this last slide in the image in the far corner here of this young lady with the sign Justice for Sugarland 95, because when these bodies were found, this made an impact not only on Black residents of Sugarland, but Black people in the Houston area in general, right? Feeling a connection to this history. And so in some ways, this goes beyond just the actual residents of Sugarland, right? Folks have an investment in how this gets treated, how the Sugarland 95 get memorialized, just based on our shared history of oppression and culture, which is what you find most of the time when a Black cemetery is discovered. The people who actually take the greatest sort of investment in that space are people with that shared ancestry, right? So given that there's kind of a foundational understanding that Sugarland is kind of seen and has produced itself as a white space, certainly the discovery of the Sugarland 95 calls into question, right, that history and the current state of Sugarland's identity. Like Dr. Jach mentioned earlier, and Mr. Collins kind of reiterated for us, the Sugarland 95 are 94 Black men and 1 woman, ranging from ages 14 to 70, who were imprisoned and leased to the Imperial State Prison Farm. And even though Reginald Moore, as we know, had been warning the school district that they had purchased land where bodies could be, there was construction done that began on a new school. And of course, they start to find bodies, right? Much of the process that the school district goes through, right, to unearth these bodies, hire archaeologists, tell this story, it still hasn't shifted much of how we understand Sugarland, right? If you would look up Sugarland's history, much of it is the Ellis and Cunningham narrative, right? Or it's very much focused primarily on the incorporation. There's no discussion about what's going on in Sugarland prior to like the 1950s. Discovery of the Sugarland in 85, you do see more recognition of that, but so much to be desired in credit to success. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I do not know what just happened.
It's okay. I was about to say we lost you, but there you are.
Okay.
Let's go ahead and start over or start where you were.
That has never happened until, of course, right now. Okay. Let me share my screen again. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, even though there have been efforts to memorialize and to deal with this discovery, right, there still seems to be much that needs to be said, right, about how foundational Black labor was to the success of Sugarland and to the ongoing success of Sugarland. So kind of what we heard a little bit mentioned before, and definitely this report was referenced, but Fort Bend ISD, right, as they are supposed to do according to, you know, the laws put in place by Texas, they hire archaeologists, right, to excavate and to figure out who these people are. And they write up a field report back to bondage, which we saw Dr. Jach reference a few times. And there's discussions, right, about what to do with the bodies, which we all are probably familiar with. And at one point, there was a decision to potentially put the bodies in the Imperial Prison Farm Cemetery, which on the one hand, I recognize that was supported by some community members. But because of the multiracial nature of that cemetery, I kind of see that move as sort of leveling Black oppression and Black identity with white historical injury, meaning whatever happened to these white prison guards and prisoners who landed in this cemetery, it's a very different thing to memorialize them versus the sort of terror and egregious treatment of the Sugarland 95. And so certainly from my perspective, I'm saying this is not a Black space, and it would not necessarily do justice to the Sugarland 95. So ultimately, as we all know, they are not moved, right? And they are memorialized currently in the Bullhead Cemetery, where, you know, which allows the remains not to be disturbed. But as we know, the markings are sort of limited. There's not information about, which names go with which remains. So our gravestones are unknown, number so-and-so. And there's also questions about the historical accuracy with naming it the Bullhead Camp Cemetery, right? So I want to read this quote from the Convict Labor and Leasing Project report that they've posted on their website. That says the resting site of the Sugarland 95 is a place of great historical significance, but it arrived without a name. While Bullhead was the colloquial name of a prison labor camp near the Bullhead Bayou, the historical record seems to indicate that the camp and its cemetery are not the same as the site where the Sugarland 95 were discovered. So there definitely needs to be more work on not only figuring out who these people are, but also, if this is not the correct name, then is there another cemetery that is potentially the Bullhead Camp Cemetery? Are there other bodies, right? And I've done some work sort of interviewing some folks who are in charge of this kind of thing. And it's been pretty clear that no one's looking for more bodies, right? So potentially those of us living in Sugarland, going to school in Sugarland, owning homes in Sugarland, could be, living our daily lives on top of more bodies that perhaps suffered the same historical injuries as the Sugarland 95. And so certainly the Convict Labor and Leasing Project and myself and other people definitely want to push the school district and the city to look for those other bodies and to try to correct this historical inaccuracy of the name of the current cemetery. As far as digital representation, the school district has the Back to Bondage report on their site. The city of Sugarland has added a couple of slides to their historical timeline that include convict leasing. These are not highly racialized discussions, meaning you don't necessarily know that the people doing this convict labor are predominantly Black. And it's not a major part of the historical narrative, right? If you look at the site, there's a lot about the Imperial Sugar Mill, early settlers, the people who made this successful, kind of a narrative of a successful business idea, right? A sort of white colonial success story that is very Blacklist, right? Which is pretty problematic when all of the labor that made that success happen came from Black bodies. Okay. Finally, and I pulled this image from the field report where the names and other information about the individuals who were excavated was included in the report and also sent to Fort Bend County residents. My parents got a flyer in the mail as well. And the interesting thing is, I'm a cultural anthropologist, but in doing this work, I've talked to many archaeologists and folks who, have long been doing this work, in particular, Michael Blakey, who was a bioarchaeologist who worked on the African burial ground, which really comes to be the precedent for how we deal with Black remains. And his main point was all of these decisions, all of these conflicts that we're seeing are really not in good faith if we're not talking to the descendants, right? And so one of the major questions I have through my research is, who are the descendants? Why have they not been contacted before discussions of to move remains, to not remove remains, to memorialize in this way or that way? Where is the descendant community? And I use the language descendant community because Michael Blakey himself, whose site was actually from the 1700s, says, of course, it's hard to find people that might be biologically linked, but you certainly have information about individuals who are culturally and historically linked. I myself, as a Black woman growing up in Missouri City, think of myself as part of the descendant community of the Sugarland 95. And I think for that reason, I am not satisfied with what has been done currently from the school district and from the city. And so, as an activist scholar, on the one hand, I am presenting the sort of behavior of the city and the school district that's preserving a white identity, but I'm also looking to be part of the next steps to find descendants and to employ a political move that will satisfy the descendant community. So with that, I thank you and I will stop. Oh, I'm sorry.
And then we have Candice.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be here with all of these scholars to talk about this really important history and to give a deeper context to the project of what I created. So I am the artist who created the project Whale, which is a ritual and what became a documentary ritual project and film around the Sugarland 95, but not just them specifically, but the larger concept of convict leasing in the Sugar Bowl region of Texas, which includes Fort Bend, Matagorda, Brazoria counties, and Wharton County. And how my work positions itself within all this, the historicity of this, is that we often say artist, but I think of myself more as a cultural worker. And Toni Cade Bambara, who is a Black queer, filmmaker and writer. A quote of hers that really resonates deeply with me and my work is that the role of a culture worker of an oppressed people is to make the revolution irresistible. So in that sense, everything that I produce, all of the work that I do is toward the aim of what does a liberated world look like? And it definitely comes from the lens of being a Black first-generation Haitian woman, from being a mother who has single parented. All of these things inform, through my lens, what are the possible ways that a society that doesn't have a need for systems of oppression that is free looks like. The concept of whale is based on two very particular, very different quotes that have very overlapping themes. When I think about, as a culture worker, when I see videos of Black and brown bodies killed, like on television and promoted on social media, I recognize that my first reaction no longer is grief, it's to be numb, because we've been so numb to this image of Black death in the public sphere. And when I think about this process of numbing, this collective process of numbing by being reinforced with these images, I sometimes was feeling myself wishing that I could go into the street and wail about this. Like, why aren't there on the blocks where we know violence has occurred, people to just openly weep? And instead we're kind of just shaking our head and going on about our day as we must. And when I would think about this concept of what it would be like to just go to a place, maybe go to where Breonna Taylor was murdered, or go to where George Floyd was murdered, and to weep there, to shed tears there, I thought of a Bible verse that said, "Where are the wailing women?" And that became the impetus for the project. And in thinking about that concept from the Bible of where the wailing women are, I thought about in indigenous African traditions, and even in diasporic African traditions, at funerals, it is customary to wail openly. And in Western society, this is considered not something that is, it's considered improper. You know, we're supposed to mourn quietly, but in these traditions, you wail and you scream, and there's women who literally will get on the ground and roll around. And I thought about, and I did some research, and there's some collective wellness to that these women are wailing openly to signal that there is an open space for grief to be felt. And what happens to a society that cannot grieve is that all of us are walking around with so many losses, collectively and personally, that have no place to exist. So that was the impetus for me considering where are places of land history that's traumatic, that could use some wailing, that we might shed some water, shed some tears for. And as I was doing research, I'm not a Texas native, I'm a transplant from California. As I was doing some research, I thought, oh, this story about where the Sugarland 95 were buried, that seems like a place that, you know, could use some wailing. I got in, that was before I understood how deep the story was. But I have a bachelor's in Black Studies and a master's in public administration. So it's an interesting intersection that I realized that the intellectual discourse around history doesn't change hearts. It doesn't change minds. Change happens at the point where we can bypass the intellect, which often has barriers to how we experience empathy. And we have to get back into our body. We have to get back into our humanity, which is usually not at the level of mind. And that is where I have found that the intersection for me, as someone who does have maybe a formal academic background, but has chosen art as the vehicle by which I make change for liberation, I can bypass the intellect in some ways to try to aim for the body, physical, heart space, to merge the two. So I'm going to show a clip if you haven't seen Whale yet, which I am biased and I totally think that you should. It includes ritual performance inspired by 5 different African diasporic traditions, the funerary traditions from 5 African diasporic practices. And that visual is overlaid on top of some crafted text from me, some text pulled from the Bible, some text that I've written as a writer, and documentary interviews with scholars such as Dr. Naomi Reed. And overlaying those texts has an interesting effect, which you'll see in just a second. So we'll play a clip. It's about 4 minutes.
Thus says the Lord of hosts. Consider and call for the mourning women that they may come, and send for skillful wailing women that they may come. Let them make haste and take up a wailing for us, that our eyes may run with tears and our eyelids gush with water. For a voice of wailing is heard from Zion. How we are plundered. We are greatly ashamed, because we have forsaken the land, because we have been cast out of our dwellings. Yet, hear the word of the Lord, O women, and let your ear receive the word of his mouth. Teach your daughters wailing, and everyone, her neighbor, a lamentation. For death has come through our windows, has entered our palaces to kill off the children, no longer to be outside, and the young men no longer on the streets. Speak. Thus says the Lord. Even the carcasses of men shall fall as refuse on the open field, like cuttings after the harvester, and no one shall gather them.
The history of Sugarland usually is told from about the 1950s onward, because that's when the area gets incorporated as a city. But we definitely are now aware. I mean, we were aware prior, but we know that people have occupied that area for a long time. And, you know, a lot of indigenous scholars have done the work to show that the Karankawa Indians were the ones who occupied most of the land around Houston and the suburbs surrounding Houston. And most of, I guess, the point in which we get slave labor or sort of settler colonial populations is around the time that, you know, Stephen F. Austin and other folks from Virginia bring slaves to this area, which that's the old 300 narrative you hear everyone talking about. But the really sort of the most important historical moment for the Sugarland 95, I would say, would be in the early 1900s, you know, towards the end of the 1800s, where convict leasing comes into play. So right after the Civil War, most of the South, right, is very vulnerable and, you know, loses their labor force. And so the way in which folks kind of design a fix for that, right, is through, as you mentioned in your questions, the 13th Amendment, where there's sort of this loophole, right, where people can be put into servitude for all kinds of sort of ambiguous issues, right? So not having a job, vagrancy.
Thank you, Ashley, for playing that. I'm in the yellow. That's me. So that is a bit from the prologue of Whale. That's from the opening. And it goes through the project itself, as far as the concept and process of it, it goes through 5 different elements. The 5 elements being in order: earth, water, nature, mineral, and fire. The 5 elements are also correlated to the color scheme. Each of those colors correlates to an element. And these are elements as believed in the Dagara cosmology, the Dagara of Burkina Faso, where most of my work is inspired by Dr. Elder Malidoma Some and his work about ritual and the necessity for ritual in Western societies. And the Dagara of Burkina Faso, West Africa, fire itself is the portal to the ancestors. And in this cosmology, which is kind of the large container in which this project is held, for fire, we had a community ritual in which we called for any community members to come to the site of the Bullhead, or what is called the Bullhead Camp Cemetery, to create together a ritual. And the Dagara Society, there's funerary tradition, and then after the funeral, there's this concept that those who have passed, then after you cry, you must cry to help sever the connection between them and the living. After that, there's another step that I think is an interesting concept to consider in the West, for those of us in the West, is that then after you have cried to wash them away, that's not the end. You now must go get them and bring them back into the community. And the idea is that when you bring them back, they have a work to do. And you can ask them to intervene on behalf of scenarios and situations they may have caused while they were alive, or intervene on behalf of situations that need resolve. I really was interested in this because in looking at history, we often look back at history as if it's something static, which absolves us in the present of any duty to do any real work. If we talk about convict leasing as something that happened between 1877 and 1912, then we lose that this is just a marker in a continuum of practices that has informed us today. Then we lose the continuum of this convict leasing is the precursor to what we now know as the prison industrial complex. This convict leasing after enslavement is part of the reason why I white knuckle my steering wheel when a cop pulls behind me, even though I know that I'm committing no crime. And it also, if I don't view this particular phenomena as part of a continuum, I am robbed of my ability to interact in the now. Sometimes these problems are so big, so I thought, well, the Dagara cosmology gives us another place to kind of play with time so that I can interact with the history of that moment in the past, in the present, to shape the future. And so I found that to be really, really, really inspiring to say that what could happen if these bodies, instead of memorializing them as if they are gone, we bring them home, we bring them back, and we ask them to help us to intervene in our present to shape our future in ways that no longer look like what they had to endure. So that was something that we considered and created community ritual around for the fire ritual, which is at the end of the piece. The other elements are inspired by 4 other African diasporic traditions that I felt had land connection to the space. One of them is Haitian Vodou. Haiti and the island of Hispaniola, where we know Haiti and Dominican Republic share, was also a sugarcane colony and has some similarity with the high rate of death and all of the issues that come with harvesting sugarcane, which we know is very labor intensive and very, very dangerous. There was which I found interesting in the research, is the Bakongo people of Angola. In the sugar bowl, in some of the sugar cabins were found the Bakongo cross. The Bakongo cross is this continued belief in the idea that when you put this particular cross in a space, it's a point of connection between the living world and the ancestor realm to protect against evil and to call forth assistance, to call forth help. And I thought it was really important to honor those people, those persons who worked in sugar cabins who were still holding on to those remnants of African connection. We did Black Southern tradition. So you'll see there's like the hats and the gloves, like you see on Easter Sunday, because this takes place in the South. And that's a prominent tradition, the Christian or Baptist church tradition. And the other with the elaborate rah-rah, I felt inspired by the Ifa of Yoruba and some of the ways that that has been stylized over time with certain orishas in that practice. And I use each kind of diasporic or indigenous practice to engage with this history on this land. What was really important also, I felt, is that I interview a man, Absalom Yabsira, who is a Karankawa native, because before we can deal with enslavement, and then it's almost perfected older brother, convict leasing, or younger brother, convict leasing, we have to talk about how the land was acquired, who was there first, and how did they leave? What are the conditions for them no longer having possession of the land? And so that land history itself was very, very interesting. And I feel it's not enough a part of the conversation. So I did interviews with these four people who shared with me different vantage points. Kofi Taharka from the National Black United Front, who was very active in the history around reparation, in the activism around reparations, specifically in Sugarland. Sugarland 95 was actually named by Derek Muhammad. It was not named by Fort Bend ISD. Some information that came up in these interviews as far as what is the story on the ground by local activists who are not affiliated with Fort Bend ISD. And there's so much information that needs to be known related to how the land has been treated today and why it continues to be in contention. And I am going to continue an archive of these recordings, of these interviews. They're currently on my website. So when you watch the project, you'll see snippets of what we could fit in an hour. And the long form of these interviews are on my website. So that's Absalom Yatsira, who's a member of the Chief Council of the 5 clans for the Karankawa people. There is Dr. Naomi Reed, who's here with us today. Jay Jenkins, who is the president and co-founder of the Convict Leasing and Labor Project. And also there is brother Kofi Taharka. So in addition to this being a beautiful artistic vision, I hope, is the idea that we have to create more imagery around these histories so that they become personalized. And so that the histories can get out and using art as the vehicle for creating that type of change. So I hope that you watch it, and I hope that you share the project and the growing archive on my website with as many people as you can, because it's a digestible bit of history. Thank you.
Thank you, Candice. Thank you, Naomi. Thank you, Theresa. And thank you, Mr. Sam Collins. I'm going to ask Erica and everybody to turn their camera back on, and we have a few minutes for question and answers, Q&A time. I'm going to go ahead and kick off with a question for our panelists and ask, what are the next steps? I mean, like we've learned tonight about the history and kind of the different concepts and practices to honor individuals related to Sugar Land 95 and to bring awareness to the history of convict labor leasing. But what's next? Anyone can answer. Yeah.
I can jump in. I mean, I think a number of academics are certainly looking at this situation for a number of different reasons. I know there's a lot of, I don't want to give away too much, but there's, a podcast in the works. I know there's documentaries, work about Reginald Moore. I think people are really focused on just getting the message out. I think the problem is there's the what next for the folks who are of the community and invested, and then the what next for the folks who have the power. So I think the immediate what next for everybody, like I said, should be finding the descendants and find out if they want any of this happening, right? Which is why I love Candice's, spiritual, video and activity, because I mentioned this to her, much of any sort of spiritual or religious commemoration that's happened has been assumed to be Christian. And so I like that she's sort of expanding the possibilities there, which I don't know. I think to really know what to do next is to ask the descendants. I'll say that.
And I'd like to point out, there is continuing work to find descendants. Dr. Helen Graham is kind of leading the genealogy research. I know she put in the chat where they're working on family trees. So that's something that, somebody asked, like, what are the academics doing? And I know that that's something that we all want to know. As a historian, I want to know who the people are, and we've got good people doing that work, trying to find who they are, who they're related to. I know it's a daunting task, but they are indeed working as hard as they can on it. So that is happening.
I think in the project, I include just a snippet of what Dr. Naomi Reed said, because that was a question I asked all of the interview participants. And beside curriculum, she mentioned curriculum. There's got to be changes to curriculum so that this information is known. One thing that overlapped with all of the interview participants is the idea of reparations has to occur. We know that there are specific people and organizations and companies that profited from this exploitation of labor and human life. And in addition to finding the lineal descendants, we need to have a renewed conversation about reparations and what these organizations, companies, and even cities and counties owe to these descendants and owe to the creation of new vehicles of change in the region. I also think for all of us, there's a conversation that we need to have that we've been grappling with about abolition, how the prison industrial complex is continuing to prey on Black and brown bodies. Today, prisons continue to be able to exploit the labor of inmates, which continues to make incarcerating Black and brown bodies profitable. And when we have a profit margin to prison and policing, we have an interesting problem. So convict leasing hasn't ended, it's shifted, and there's a place for all of us to kind of start to grapple with reparations and abolition as a part of our work moving forward.
Dr. Jach, there's a question in the chat, and that is whether the Imperial Sugar Company has acknowledged its role in leasing Black prisoners.
Very minimally. They mention, but I don't think that they acknowledge just how much the profit of their company came on the backs of these people. I don't think there's really been a real acknowledgement of that. I think that they put it on, maybe their website and briefly mention it, but there is been, as Naomi pointed out, there's a lot of attempt to kind of gloss over it, focus on positive things and not actually look at it. So I would say that they could do a lot better job at acknowledging and accepting what their role in it was.
As we wait for other questions, I have a question. This is just to the panel. You know, as we are here, well, as I am here at the African American Library at the Gregory School, and we are an archival and research center, I would like to know what your experience was in using the archives. And I know Candice touched a little bit about this, and I think you did, Dr. Reed, as well, about using the archives to create and or inform your work.
Well, I mean, I can talk, you know, from a historian's perspective. When I started doing research, not everything was digitized. I had to go and like dig in giant conduct ledger books, and it's painful to see people's names written down and how many lashes they were given, what kind of punishments they had. There were lots and lots of times that when I was doing research that I just have to like get up and walk out of the room because it's too much. So yeah, a lot of dusty archives. Luckily now a lot of that stuff is online. And so you can find that. You can find a lot of the records, you know, like in ancestry.com and stuff. They have convict registers that people can look and see, and you can see where people get transferred to, where they're at. And I know that the people that are doing the genealogy research for this are using a lot of that information.
I'd like to add also that, you know, Baldwin also speaks about these innocent people are trapped in a history they don't understand. So in the museum we have here in Galveston, we've put on display a convict labor contract that was signed by Ball, Hutchins and Company here in Galveston in 1893. Had an attorney come in to visit the gallery that had never saw one of these labor contracts, and they felt, you know, having been a contract or a lawyer that had dealt with contract law, that it was unbelievable that they had never saw one of these contracts and how it was written, how well it was written, and what it meant to those that were affected by it. So I just think it's important that we be proactive and create spaces where these documents can be viewed and seen by those that have never, you know, seen them before.
I can just say, as a cultural anthropologist, I'm new to the archives. I know I've been to the Gregory School with Erica before when I was focused on sort of race and curriculum in US history. And, you know, even in that space, I was more interested in what living, breathing people were doing, interacting with stuff there. But since coming to this project, I have definitely been to the state archive for sure to look at the convict ledgers, right? And kind of that is, you know, because my interest is so much, you know, on the one hand, focusing on what the city and the school district are doing, but also the descendant community. I've kind of on my own, and I know some other folks have as well, tried to look through the convict ledgers and trace some of those folks through ancestry.com. I'm definitely not a pro at that. But there have been connections that are, you know, not, you know, obviously we don't have the DNA, right? But folks who have oral history, right, within their family that say, yeah, I think this matches up with what my great grandmother told me. And I know that's difficult too, because some of the people I've talked to, they're like, I know this history and I don't really want to talk to my family member about this. And I don't want to participate in any way. But I do think looking at the the details of the ledgers, which I know Dr. Jach, I can agree with that. It was not pleasant, and especially finding ledgers about child prisoners. That was definitely one of those moments where I was like, okay, like I got to take a break. But that I think has more information or more useful information about who to look for today than potentially than the DNA could even tell us. So.
It looks like we have some questions in the chat. One that I will pass to either Naomi or Sam, because both of you have connections and have mentioned, but Devin is asking who Reginald Moore is and what is his role in knowing where the bodies were there. So if either one of y'all want to shine light on that, his history and presence.
Yeah, Mr. Moore was what we consider a subject matter expert in this area that had done decades of research through land records and had really done the work and identified the general area, not the exact spot, but that there was a cemetery on the prison format. And forgive me for not being able to turn on my video. I had to leave the space where I was at to pick up my wife, so I can't put the video on in the car, but the audio is working. So Mr. Moore, again, had done decades of research. He had worked in the prison system, and that's when he first got interested in it. He was a guard in the prisons that he had worked in. He started researching because he said the imagery of seeing the guards on the horse with the guns and most of the prison laborers being Black men or minorities just looked like slavery to him. And from that, once the bodies were discovered, for him, it was that he was finally proven right all of his research. So I will let Naomi add to that, but he is definitely a champion of the work, and we must remember him at every chance we can to acknowledge his work, even though he was not Dr. Moore by the standards of the academic community. He had definitely done the work and the research and the labor to make sure that this history was known.
I was completely going to defer to Mr. Collins because I did not know Reginald Moore personally, but my understanding is definitely he is sort of the original organic intellectual whose predictions came true, who everyone ignored until there were physical remains that weren't deniable. So I think in addition to the 95 and the descendant community, Mr. Moore is definitely just as foundational a character to this narrative. So that's all I'm going to add.
Thank you both. We do have another question in the chat, and that is, how do you suggest we connect to the other communities that are connected through lineage? There are deep connections to other descendant communities in the area. So how do you make those connections?
I'm not sure I understand the question entirely.
There are deep connections to other descendant communities in the area. How do you suggest we connect to the other communities that are connected through this lineage?
So I guess what I understand that to mean is sort of other.
I don't know if that's asking to connect directly to the Sugarland 95, or if you're talking about non-African Americans, because I would like to see a research report done on those that are connected to, these establishments like the Imperial Sugar and these other companies and families, because they were benefited from this system. And while they were not individually responsible, they may not even know the connection, and if they were made conscious of it, maybe they would be more supportive of the work or given the opportunity to be more supportive. Now, some will resist talking about this because they don't want any with their family legacy. But I think it's important to create an opportunity for them to do something substantial in correcting the wrongs that have been done, to be able to be a part of the solution of healing in this situation. While we cannot go back and change the past, they definitely can put in some things to help heal the present and help do the repair work from the damage that was done. So that's the angle I would take on those other communities.
Additionally, the Karankawa people are still around. The original inhabitants of this land are still here and are actually still fighting over two particular areas where remains have been found. One of them is in Sienna Plantation right now. There's two prominent cases. And the other one is in, I think, somewhere also in Missouri City, outside of Sugar Land. And so I think a very good place to begin is to recognize, number one, that the land we're even talking about came through genocide and displacement of Native people who are still fighting for recognition. And when the Sugar Land 95, as we call them, those bodies were found, it wasn't known if they were Native people first or who they belonged to. They very well could have been a Native burial ground, which is still also very present. So I think getting involved with the issues as defined by the Karankawa peoples themselves and helping support by giving resources or in any way we can isn't a really good connection to other descendant communities.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat from Alonzo and asking, are there any relatives of the men who were leasing convicts that are still in the area? If so, have they commented on the Sugar Land 95?
I'm sure there are. I have lots and lots of names in my research of guards, prison managers, people that were involved in that. I know that there are connections to families that were quite prominent in Richmond's history, for example. Have I tracked down their relatives, their descendants, and asked them, what do you think about this? No, but maybe that's something that would be useful, interesting to find out. It's because I've focused so much on the prisoners themselves and their lives, and not so much what happens to the guards. But yeah, I have lots and lots and lots of names and lots of testimony about particularly horrible ones and cruel behavior. I gave a talk a few years ago down in Lake Jackson, and there was a guard that was there that was in the records as being really abusive and horrible. And some of his descendants were there, and they did not like that I had used his name. So they were quite unhappy with my talk, but I didn't care. So yeah, I don't know. Be interesting to look at. Maybe that'll have to be my next project. I don't know.
We have another question, and I actually skipped over one, so I'm going to combine these because they're both about the archives. One is asking if there are gaps, whether, I guess, in genealogical research or in the digitization of archival items that, I guess, need to be filled. And this question from friend of Gregory, Tanya, speaks to the fact that Mr. Moore's archives are at Rice University, but were not available to the public as of a couple months ago. And I will add a note to this, but to complete her question, how do we make sure the archives are accessible to the general public? And the note I will say, as you all kind of answer this question, sometimes when donors give things to archival collections, they have the right to put certain stipulations as to when those items are released to the public, or for the parameters of public use, research, that kind of thing. So some of that is a part of the donor process, but the question is, how do we make sure that archives are accessible to the public?
So again, for my own personal research, when I first started looking into this, there were a lot of documents that were sealed and I had to file to get them opened because they had people's names and things in them that they didn't want, some investigations and things. I do know that there are, like the Texas Prison Museum up in Huntsville has some documents, but digitizing is expensive. And for a small museum without a lot of money, they don't always have the wherewithal to get things digitized, where the Texas State Archives can do that. When I first started researching, the conduct ledgers and convict registers were actually not in Austin. They were in the process of being transferred, and like they didn't know where they were at, and it took a couple of months for them to track them down and find them when I first started looking at them. So there's a lot of stuff. There are hundreds and hundreds of photographs that the prison museum has that they have in their archives. But as far as just like the general public being able to go into an archive and research, I mean, you have to fill out some paperwork and go through that. But so it's not a real easy, smooth process for just somebody that's just interested to go. You have to have some kind of research agenda before you can usually even get into an archive, which I don't have an answer for that. But I believe in the case of Mr. Moore that there were some restrictions put on initially, but I think that some of those have been lifted. I'm not sure what all is available there. I don't know if there's anybody connected to Rice in the call that could answer that better for us.
Thank you. So I just want to be mindful of time. So this will be our last question. And I think it's a really great question from in the chat that says, do you have any suggestions on how we can learn from this experience to improve our response to oppression? What are suggestions for people that might be interested in change, but yet might not have quite the knowledge? And that can be open to anybody who wants to respond.
I'll just say that's one of my students. But Candice, you look like you wanted to go. You go.
Yeah, I also do Theater of the Oppressed anti-racism workshops. And one of the things, again, this is where I've really come to that responses to oppression, what happens is the more knowledge, intellectual knowledge you have doesn't translate into a body physical reaction. And some of those responses have been culled by collectively the society in which we live. And so it needs to be a physiological body change, because everybody's response to oppression is physiological. It's not just intellectual. And so if you change it on the intellect, but you don't change it on a physical kind of hard space or have places to do that, you find that people have better jargon, but in practice, their first responses to oppression or to witnessing oppression are to continue to not intervene or not interact or things like that. So it's something that has to be learned in praxis. You have to practice it daily and kind of start small and surround yourself with people and opportunities to practice a new response to stimulus, which is essentially what it is.
I just want to add one thing to that. And I would say, I think the best way to move forward is to listen to the oppressed, not to think of the oppressed as people of the past, because certainly there are those of us that connect to this history very personally, or we embody, a lot of the sort of institutions or ideologies that created this situation. And I think there is a need, particularly on the academic side, to listen to scholars of color, to, if not hire, then consult, Black archaeologists when it's an archaeological site, right? Ask, I say this because I think that the way that it turned out for the African burial ground was so different because there were so many Black academic voices, folks who were trained to think about the community first because they are of the community. And I think, that's sort of, I think, a fundamental first step, at least from the academic side.
Can I say one more thing that's so important to me? Is that I think what's important, especially if you're racialized as white in our society, is that you realize that when you intervene in oppression, you're not saving anyone else. That the effect of racism, the first casualty of a racially based society were white persons themselves, because it created within whiteness a sociopathy, like a limited empathy as a modus operandi of relation. And when you intervene, I think sometimes when we focus on these histories, the reason that Cunningham's name and Ellis's name can continue in Sugarland on monuments and on parks is because we focus only on the Black death or the Black trauma, and we don't shift the focus to actually the perpetration. That's what needs intervention. The perpetration of violence is what needs the intervention. So I think shifting that lens for all of us is very critical, because if you only intervene when you see an act of oppression, that means Black people have to die before you will intervene. And it also means that for Black persons or minority persons, that we continue to memorialize death without actually knowing the names of the perpetrators who continue to live amongst us day to day, unnamed, unknown. And I think it's shedding a light on whiteness or the system itself, and not just the victims, recognizing that those who benefit are being victimized themselves, will help, I think, white people to avoid white saviorism, and help also Black people to shift a point of departure in that we don't have to intervene just at trauma. The intervention is also in knowing, if we're talking about Ahmaud Arbery, who are the names of the killers? If we're talking about, Breonna Taylor, who are the names of those people? And if you don't know them, you know that oppression has sought to remove those names from you, that we only know the names of Black victims. We never know the names of white perpetrators. So I think that's a critical shift in the dialogue, and also a point of intervention focus.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think this has been such an amazing conversation and opportunity to hear everybody's perspectives. We know that the work to continue to honor the Sugarland 95 and bring awareness to the history of the convict labor leasing and the trauma and issues connected to the Fort Bend County and Wharton County, and in terms of land and labor, is ongoing, and will be a community effort to continue to bring awareness to the topics. I want to give an opportunity for everybody to say any last remarks. And then I know a lot of people in our chat are asking how do they connect with you. So if you want to put your information or your website in the chat, feel free to. But this has been such a wonderful conversation. Erica, is there any last words before we hand it over to the panelist?
No, I just want to express my sincere gratitude to everyone assembled. All of you are friends of the Gregory School, and so it's wonderful to be in conversation and see faces we haven't seen for a minute. And just thank you to everyone who joined us tonight. This was really, really good. And I think really quickly, part of the work at Gregory School is to preserve these histories and to tell these stories. If there's no story that's too small. We're not about the first or the most important or the flashy title or esteemed personality. Ours is a community history. So if you have information, I know some people were talking about family members and things like that, let us help you preserve it. Candice, we need to be talking about your archive. So I just want to put that out there, that we need to actively be doing this work so that the story is there to be told. So just super grateful, and thank you all again.
Panelists, any last words?
I want to say thank you for including me. It was really wonderful. And Candice, your project is beautiful, and I look forward to seeing the entire thing. And Naomi, thank you for your perspective. It's nice to be able to have these kind of conversations, and thank you for including me, Erica, and the rest of you. I appreciate it. And Sam. Good to see
I
you
would
too.
also like to say, yeah, it's good to see you too, Dr. Jach. And all the panelists, thank you for allowing there to be some male representation with all these intelligent females on the panel. I felt a little intimidated by all this knowledge and all these credentials. Everyone did a wonderful job. And again, I'm down in Galveston with the Juneteenth Legacy Project. I did put it in the chat. Would love for y'all to come down and see the 5,000 square foot mural and the work that we're doing in Galveston. All of these communities are dovetailed together. They're connected, separated by a few miles, but the names of individuals in Sugar Land are some of the same individuals in Galveston County, Brazoria County, and all of these counties are interconnected. So thank you again for the opportunity and look forward to future programs.
I'll just say thank you as well to my fellow panelists and also to Erica and Ashley for inviting me. And I'm sort of, I guess, just repeating what Dr. Jach said, but Candice, your work is amazing. And I want to see more from you. And I thank all the people who were in the audience as well.
I'm really grateful to have been here with you, Dr. Jach and Dr. Naomi, to hear all about your research. And I'm so grateful, and Sam, to just be able to learn from all of the work that you guys are doing. And it's really phenomenal. And I hope everyone has a chance to check out Whale. It's on view until November 14th. And if you've watched it and you enjoyed it, I would love for you to reach out or send me a note or a message. Yeah, thank you.
All righty. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. I'm going to ask the panelists just to stay on really quickly. But everybody, thank you so much. It's been a great night.